think we are live streaming, so, and because that clock is a little slow, I was waiting a bit, but I think we'll get started since all of us are here. So welcome to the City Council study session here on Monday, July 15th. And we have one major topic tonight. And our planning manager, Wade Burkholder, and planner 2, Eric Sampson, are here to present to give us an update on short-term rentals. And as they come up to the table here, I'd like to thank those who've been working on this. When you look back, it's been at least 2 years. I know conversations have been going on for longer than that, but this has been a long process of lots of studying, lots of investigating, lots of conversations. So I appreciate the work that everyone has done. And with that spirit, please begin our conversation with council tonight. And just remind you that these are very sensitive. I mean, they speak close to them, and then the public that are listening at home will have a better time hearing.
Can do. So good evening, Mayor Olson, members of council. I'm going to start off with an apology first from Director Power. He wanted to be here tonight. However, he had a home improvement emergency that required him to be in Boulder. So he sends his apologies for not being here. Myself, I'm going to provide you an overview of how we got here tonight. Eric will talk about the actual language that has been recommended to you by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And then I also want to introduce Kate Townley, the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as Mike Freemeyer, the vice chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission. They are here to also participate and answer questions and enter into a dialogue with you all if necessary, if you see fit. So they're also here as a resource. So the journey began in 2017 with the City of Englewood, with the Planning Commission and Community Development staff starting to discuss and looking at the facets of the short-term rental phenomenon. Relatively speaking, it's a new land use category. It's something we hadn't seen before and definitely have not seen with this much popularity before in specific regards to a zoning ordinance and whatnot, and the effects on the community and so forth. So as short-term rentals were gaining in popularity in both the Front Range, the state of Colorado, as well as nationwide, jurisdictions really struggled with what to do and how to handle them. You know, you can look up and down the Front Range today and see communities that simply ban them. You see communities that have regulatory processes in place to mitigate some of the negative impacts that may occur to the neighborhoods that they're located in. So in 2017, as I mentioned, you know, we really started that discussion with our Planning and Zoning Commission as to how to get a handle on this emerging trend in basically rental properties in the community. In Englewood, the regulatory framework that you see tonight has been through a very thoughtful vetting process by the Planning and Zoning Commission and is recommended for adoption. The Planning and Zoning Commission really took their time to discuss the time, place, and manner that short-term rentals could potentially operate in Englewood, and so the language you have in your packet reflects that. Planning and Zoning had 14 study sessions over the 2 years to discuss this matter. They conducted an open house as well as a community forum where we brought in neighboring jurisdictions to talk about their experiences with short-term rentals in their communities, to see if we could learn more best practices that we could implement potentially here in Englewood that they have already gone through. And on June 4th, the Planning and Zoning Commission held a public hearing on the language you see before you tonight. At that meeting, there were 5 people that spoke in opposition to the language and 1 that supported the language. So Planning and zoning really looked at, I'll say, the pros and cons of short-term rentals. You know, the first pro that they came up with is that there really is a need for quality lodging in Englewood. The two large players in Englewood, as you know, are Craig Hospital and Swedish, and they frequently just simply run out of rooms on their medical campuses to house families. And they've really started to rely on the short-term rental to put families in so that they can stay close to their loved ones that are in the hospital. You know, as we work with them as on an ongoing basis, that's one of the main topics, you know, they continue to bring up is we're running out of room. Can we look at campus expansion for these hospitals, more on-site housing for them? But that's going to take time, so they continue to rely on surrounding neighborhoods and short-term rentals in the community to fill that void. Currently, with a very cursory review of the three big websites, Airbnb, VRBO, and HomeKey, we're estimating approximately 130 short-term rentals in operation in Englewood. I'll put a big asterisk by that because, as you know, Englewood address, jurisdiction, boundaries, whatever, you know, go all the way east. So it's very difficult to determine where. So, you know, that's our best guess right now is about 130. However, we simply can't, you know, research. There are dozens of sites that list properties for rent in this type of manner, and we just don't have the resources to look through all of them and try to figure out the addresses and whatnot. So our current regulations as they relate to short-term rentals really falls within the definition of visitor accommodation. And visitor accommodations are basic stays of less than 30 days. And
Could I interrupt you for just 1 second?
Sure.
Would you prefer to go through what you want to go through with us and then ask questions, or do you want
If-
questions now?
if I could.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Is
You'll
that-
be, go ahead.
My question was, you are suggesting that there's 130 in operation currently, right now?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
So visitor accommodations, by that definition of a rental of less than 30 days, is prohibited in all of our residential zone districts. Therefore, based on that regulation, short-term rentals are prohibited in the city of Englewood at the current. If you are renting for longer than 30 days, you are considered an actual household, and the tenancy is arranged on a month-to-month basis, or for a longer period is classified as household living, which is of course permitted. So that's where we are today with our regulations. You know, further advantages that the Planning and Zoning Commission looked at or considered when discussing short-term rentals. Short-term rentals can be taxed and therefore create revenue for the city. Short-term rentals can be inspected for health and safety issues. As I mentioned, short-term rentals do meet a market demand for lodging, and short-term rentals often can assist owners afford their mortgage payments. So that's an option people are using as well. Now, we do know that short-term rentals does have another side, and short-term rentals may impact a neighborhood negatively if bad tenants or bad owners are operating the short-term rental. Secondary public nuisances such as noise, trash, fighting, disturbing the peace, and other possible issues are accounted for and can be accounted for in the code and by code enforcement staff. So there's There's the issue of actually renting the house for less than 30 days, and all of these what I'm calling secondary issues that may be a problem, may not. So we can cover those secondary nuisances already in the code itself, but if we do want to look at permitting short-term rentals, as this language suggests, we're going to come up with this new language as has been recommended. So enforcement and compliance of these regulations could and is considered a disadvantage. Short-term rentals will continue to be used in Englewood, whether or not they are officially authorized by this framework of regulation or not. So my point here is, if you prohibit them and do continue on our path we are now, enforcement's a struggle. If we permit them, enforcement may still be a struggle. So that's the decision that we're introducing you tonight. That will have to be discussed and made when going through this process. Prohibition of relying on the current regulations does come with its enforcement challenges, such as, we're not sure who's operating short-term rentals. We don't know for sure where. We rely on case-by-case enforcement, which is not a good practice. A neighbor may say this address is operating a short-term rental, but across the street, they may just not be aware of it. So you're setting up these divisions in the neighborhood as well. So if we have a consistent across-the-board permitting system, we can begin to effectively and fairly regulate the short-term rentals. The other issue, as I mentioned, is the resources needed to monitor the websites is currently not feasible for staff. There are other options that I can talk about here in a few minutes with regard to how we might look at enforcement. But I do think enforcement is an issue that's going to need further study sessions with you all. Tonight we're presenting the language that the Planning and Zoning Commission has recommended. So it's the beginning of the conversation. There's more to be discussed. And the recommended language Eric's going to go into now was drafted with all of these challenges in mind. The Planning and Zoning Commission did a really thorough job of coming up with pros and cons and looking at what the language would do and help try to alleviate some of the concerns with the topic, and hopefully factor out some of the current difficulties that's being experienced with regard to who's operating a short-term rental, who's not, where does the enforcement go, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric right now to give an overview of the actual language, and then I have a few more comments after that.
So what I want to do is just kind of paint a broad brushstroke of what the proposed language states about short-term rentals. First of all, for the allowed zoning districts, we do have them listed in all residential districts from low density to high density. And we also have them in all of our mixed use or multi-use zone districts as well. Short-term rentals would also be allowed in our medical districts. So overall, they would be allowed in any zoning district except for our industrial and our PUD zone districts. Overall, for the permit requirements, the language would require that the application or application for an STR be permitted on an annual basis, and so that this permit, if granted, would be required to be reviewed annually for compliance. Another part of the requirement would be a signed and notarized acknowledgement of property compliance with all city codes and ordinances, and this would include a safety checklist that the owner would sign and have notarized, and basically by that saying that I am stating that all of these criteria have been met and that my property is up to code. We would also like to see, or we would require a scaled floor plan of the STR. So that would give staff an understanding of the space that they are allowed to use for an STR, or the space that they have to use for an STR. That would include bedrooms, et cetera. And we would also require them to provide us a parking plan, for which I will kind of get into parking in just a minute here. And then just kind of the basics, we would require them to provide all the owner information, contact information in case of emergencies, et cetera. And then also for they must have a valid state Colorado tax license and an Inglewood lodging tax and an Inglewood lodging tax license as well. So 3 of those. And so that would be kind of the overall, the permit requirements. So in terms of the operating standards, what we're putting forward is that the residence to be used as an STR is also the primary residence of the owner of the property. And also at the time of the permit submittal, we would require them to, again, provide proof of ownership of the property and that they are the primary resident of the property. So in other words, if you do own property in Englewood, but if you don't reside in Englewood, you are unable to operate an STR. Yes.
Green. When you're saying that they have to live in Englewood, are you meaning on that property or just within the city of Englewood?
No, on that property.
All right, thank you.
And so the code also, or the recommended language also says that ADUs may be used as an STR, however, with the stipulation that both the residence and the ADU may not be used for like 2 STRs. You can have one or the other, not multiple. We also put limitations on the maximum number of people that can be used to use an STR, and we're maxing that number at 8. And we're also putting a maximum of 2 adults per bedroom in the regulation. And we also have the regulation that the STR must be rented under a single contract, just basically meaning that you can't have one party of 4 people in at the same time if you have another party of 4 people coming in on another contract. So there would just be one single contract that would be allowed per night or per rental period. And then so also STRs would be required to provide 1 parking space per bedroom that they are renting. And then STRs that are lacking an off-street paved parking space would be allowed to use a maximum of 2 on-street parking spaces. However, they would not be able to reserve those parking spaces for an STR use explicitly. Therefore, if, say, someone comes and they do not have a parking space for the guests, then that guest would be required to find parking just by normal means. They would not be granted a public parking space for that. And then,
Information
Yeah.
from Councilmember Wink.
Thank you, Mayor. This is probably similar to what Member Barrington just asked. I want to be absolutely clear. The owner of the property must be residing at the residence when the short-term renters are occupying that property, is that correct?
so not
Or just
necessarily,
residents of Englewood?
right, so
at the same time.
it must be their primary residence.
Okay, so if someone owns the property in Englewood, goes to the Bahamas for the month of August, they can rent their property.
Yes,
Okay, it sounded quite different than that, what you
Okay.
stated before. I just wanted to be sure about that, because that seems a prime opportunity, certainly.
yeah, so yeah, that's the intent.
Okay.
Is that, if somebody who lives on the property, usually primary residences are about, you're living on the property 10 months out of the year. Yeah, so if you do happen to go on a 2-week vacation to the Caribbean, if you want to rent out your property, you would be allowed to do that in this situation.
Thank you, continue, good clarification. I'm watchful of the time. I'm sure most of us have read all this, so just if you want to give the highlights.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, we may
So-
not get to the questions you'd like us to be asking to move this along or not.
Sure. Okay, so otherwise, we just would have the posting of all this information inside the STR. If any of you have stayed in an STR, oftentimes you'll find like a post on, like near the fireplace or on the door that has, number one, the complete set of regulations, and also who to contact in case you're having an issue or in case of emergency. So we would require to have all that. And also we included language about the revocation of permits. So for those problem properties or properties who aren't compliant with either the tax code or the zoning code, we do have the ability to revoke those permits throughout this regulation. And overall, that's it for me, honestly, for the regulation.
Great. I hurried you along and then it was the end already, sorry. So are you ready for questions? Go ahead.
Sorry. We know and we've heard, and a lot of you are likely concerned about the enforcement, and I just wanted to reiterate that enforcement is going to have to be looked at if we go, whatever way we go. If we keep it as the current language, we're going to have to figure out how to make the process clear and effective for the community. If we implement this language, we're going to potentially have to look at a third-party vendor or somehow a way to monitor the websites that are out there. On the very last page of your council communication, I included some information about the host compliance. It is a third vendor company that came into business to do exactly what we're talking about, to help local governments craft language, to assist local governments in enforcement. They actually will send out letters and make contacts with property owners themselves based on their very sophisticated algorithms and computer programs that can search out these addresses just like that, much more effectively than staff can. Since the Planning and Zoning Commission has recommended language to City Council, I want to point out that a public hearing must be held by City Council to review the recommendation of City staff, the recommendation of the Commission, and following that public hearing, Council may approve, deny, or modify proposed text amendments. And so that's what the next step is. We certainly are open to more conversations with you all if you want to dive into the enforcement a little more. But we wanted tonight to get the recommended language in front of you so we can answer questions related to that tonight as well. So that's all I had.
All right, thank you. Council, I'm going to give everybody one question so we can keep asking them and then keep coming back to people to get them all out, okay? I'll start with Councilmember Barentine.
It's not a question, it's just a clarification, so I'll use it as my question piece.
I don't know that it's on. I think it's not on, so there you
On
go.
the host compliance piece, when I read this, they are really, part of their job is really to kind of be part of the creation of the ordinances. Did they participate in this at all? Okay, thank you.
They have not.
Yeah, maybe just keep them on. Member Martinez is next.
Thanks. I want to first say thanks to the city staff and all the time that the Planning and Zoning Commission has spent on this. I really respect the work that's gone into it. My first question is the permit requirements and the safety checklist. What all would be entailed in that checklist?
So this would include everything. Let me see. I have a draft copy here that I'm looking at. So
Was that included in our packet?
It was. What was?
Because I read everything in here, but I didn't see like a list of everything I, like, would need to check.
I-
Unless it's in the,
It may have been included, but it basically was a draft short-term rental affidavit.
so is it the things that are like smoke detectors? What else? Exits, fire extinguishers?
Yeah, and it's also basically, we mark out the basic understanding of the STR regulations that say the property cannot be rented for more than 30 days, multiple contracts, the life safety issues, the parking, and
So specific to safety, it's really only those handful of couple of things.
yeah, usually it's just like fire extinguishers,
Carbon monoxide,
exits,
whatever.
yeah, egress.
And okay, thank you.
Councilmember Questa.
Thank you, Mayor. My first question would be to drill a little further down on primary residence. As I searched through the definition within the information we were presented, it states that it means a residence in which the usual place of return for housing is documented by at least two of the following documents: motor vehicle registration, driver's license, Colorado ID, voter registration, property tax notices, or a utility bill. So I could prove primary residence with a utility bill and a Colorado identification. And you can get a Colorado identification with just a utility bill. So I'm unclear on how you've defined primary resident means that somebody is living in that residence.
Typically, your license would have your current address.
Certainly you could, but if there's people that want to get around the system, I could easily get a utility bill. And Excel, I could call Excel tomorrow if I had just purchased a place, get the utility bill, then go get a Colorado ID. That's enough for me to qualify as a primary resident according to how this is written. And I could very well live in another state and still be a primary resident here. And I think that there's actually a few loopholes just built in alone to how primary resident is defined. I see business models in here, truth be told, of how somebody could get away with living in another state and still being able to qualify as a primary resident as we've defined it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilmember Questa, to clarify, in addition to those, under 1A subsection 2, an individual will have to sign and have notarized a proof of residency and ownership affidavit. And if you've been watching the Denver Post, that's how Denver has been catching people and prosecuting them for stating that it's their primary residence when in fact it's not. It's they sign and have notarized this document, and then it turns out proof shows that that's not where they're actually living. So we're trying to follow the Denver model on that section.
And I appreciate that. I've had actually many constituents send me some of those links over the past few days, and I see Denver's handing out felonies on these, and they're taking a very hard stance. However, based upon our definition, we're not even saying you have to live there. We're saying you have to produce an ID and a utility bill that has that address on it in your name. I don't see how we could even hold somebody as in violation based upon how it's defined here, is the point that I'm making. And I think that would certainly need a little bit more cleanup if council were to move forward with this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilmember Sierra.
I had similar concerns about the primary residence. I believe Denver states a primary residence is 9 months. I'm not sure if I read it within the Denver regulation or whether it was within our packet, but I just getting a clarification on what the actual time frame is for primary residence. So that's one comment. I also wanted to, Mr. Burkholder, you stated at the beginning that there are some municipalities that have banned STRs. Was Lakewood the only? I think Lakewood was the only one within the packet that stated that. Are there any others that come to mind?
City of Littleton.
They,
Littleton's taken no action on them,
Okay.
which essentially is prohibiting them
Okay.
in their code.
Thank you.
Councilmember Wink.
Thank you, Mayor. So, as you mentioned, egress in passing, along with the list of correct safety checklist. It's in here. It's a word that starts with an R. I won't slug over it. As the council reviews and perhaps modifies policy on based on our flooding and our sewage and anything city involved in terms of home ownership regulations to manage the safety. I think there are a few moving parts there, and I'm hoping and wondering if we can work in tandem with these. I mean, we have to have a public hearing, things will move forward. Perhaps they won't overlap so much so that we will have made decisions about how we're moving forward with our caliber study and what we're doing with ensuring safety in emergency type situations for residents and how temporary or permanent. I just want to make sure that any policy we might consider or write in now takes into consideration what we have been discussing about changes, very important changes for vulnerable populations, for just resilience really in the city, emergency planning. So, not sure there was a question there. I think I want to make sure we are in lockstep as we might make policy changes in that vein, which will overlap with new residents coming in under these stipulations.
Yeah.
Do you understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we would want the affidavit and the safety sign-off sheet to be flexible with whatever council comes up with or whatever changes are made in the city. So,
Does that make sense to you, Mayor?
It does to me, I mean, particularly the egress windows. I mean, one of the
Exactly.
scary things right now when you don't have any control over the ones that are in places that maybe are not safe.
And when perhaps
They
we're all
can-
not
yeah.
maybe on the same page in terms of the use of them and
Right.
the function and then why they should be to what specifications, so.
Yeah, and
That
then also the
particular
safety
area.
stuff that we are pursuing, yeah. We
Correct,
don't
okay.
want to redo the whole thing. Mayor Pro Tem next, I think, and Mr. Questa, is yours still on again? Okay, great. I'll have you after Amy.
Thank you. What about zoning regulations that prohibit those activities in certain areas? Are we intending to ignore our zoning laws? Are we intending to override zoning?
This has no intent to override any zoning laws.
But there are some protective covenants that say say for instance, R1A, it is a single-family dwelling meant only for that purpose.
Yes, and if there's covenants or deed restrictions, those are above and beyond the zoning code, so those would still remain in effect. And if you have that restriction on your deed or whatnot, that will still be in effect. So if you live in a neighborhood with an HOA that says you can't have an STR or can have a second dwelling, then that will rule the day outside of zoning.
Point
Okay,
of
so-
information, if I may.
Yeah, is it
Mayor
regarding this?
Pro Tem
Yeah.
asked about intent of maybe usurping existing zoning. Are you asking if the proposed policy changes regarding the rezoning are intentionally attempting to usurp existing
Well,
zoning?
and I
Or are
didn't-
you saying, is there something to existing zoning that perhaps hasn't been looked at based on the information in our packet?
I didn't use the word usurp.
No,
in-
I am, just to
Okay,
clarify.
right, and I think that probably in the way this has been written, would be overriding zoning, that people bought homes in certain areas for specific reasons, and now we are eliminating those reasons by allowing short-term rentals in those areas.
Could I have a point of clarification to the point of clarification?
Go for it.
Because I do believe that you have a point in that in R1 areas, businesses are not allowed to operate out of a home. And so I believe that that's a legitimate question. So if we could at least address some of that. You're not allowed to just run an automotive thing out of your house, or, I mean, you actually aren't supposed to at all, as some people who've tried to do Tupperware have found out. So it really hasn't been enforced very even-handedly, but a business like a
Correct.
short-term rental would be a much huger impact. So I agree with your question that there are some other issues.
The point of information, that
Thank
was
you.
not a question. So I just want to clarify this. And
I thought
maybe
I
the city
clarified her
attorney,
question.
point of information is asking a question to get more clarity. I would like to ask about businesses. We are allowing for home businesses throughout the city right now, correct? R1A allows for them, it depends on the,
Honestly, I would have to go back and look at the zoning
Yeah.
code. I can't answer that this evening.
I was on the council that approved some of that. It doesn't allow for industrial, but it does allow for certain small business. So Mayor Pro Tem needs to finish.
Okay, so I just, in closing that, I would like to suggest the unintended consequences of this. Apparently, in Colorado Springs, it has been taken to the county assessor about short-term rentals. And they are thinking about moving forward with taxing short-term rentals at a commercial rate in a residential zone, which means you no longer get 7.14% assessed value, it is 29%. And I believe that would be one of the huge unintended consequences that could happen. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Mr. Quest is next, and then Councilmember Sierra, and then Martinez. Is that right? No? Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. The next one that I'd like to ask a question on are the violations. So according to the proposal, STR permits may be revoked after 3 sustained violations, and it goes on to list those violations. We are aware of the rental property that was owned by Mr. Sicoli over on Washington Street, and he ended up getting a violation that had to snake its way through municipal court. We also have the current pending case on, I believe it's 4075 Jason Street that's working its way through municipal court. So both of those, to get even a single violation, are going through municipal court. Would that be the case here as well, that we would need to go through municipal court 3 times before somebody could even have a permit revoked? Or how would the violation system, how does that work?
So as I understand, the revocation process is an administrative process. It would not go through municipal court. We can revoke that at the staff level. If they continue to operate, then we need to rely on another level of enforcement, which would be municipal court.
Very good. And this might get into enforcement, which I understand is a larger discussion. So it would be planning and zoning that enforcement would fall into? Or it would be code enforcement?
Community development cannot issue summons. We don't have the ability to issue a summons, but we do have the ability to send notices of violation, work with the owner to come into voluntary compliance. But the 3 strikes would be something community development could do.
Thank you. And the follow-up to that is that using the 3 strikes term, which I think is fair, it does appear to be written that you can have those 3 strikes, have your permit revoked, but if you wait 18 months, then we'll issue you another permit, assuming that you qualify. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor.
All right. Member Sierra?
I'm going to go back to the definition of the primary residence and why I feel that that's important. So if we were to state that someone needs to live in the household for at least 9 months, then that would mean that property technically would only be available for an STR for 3 months out of the year.
So in that instance, you would still be able to reside in the residence at the same time the rental is occurring. So say you have a bedroom that you want to rent out, you can still, stay in your basement bedroom or something like
Okay.
that. So it doesn't have to be one of these.
So yeah, exactly. So you could do a bedroom in that instance. But so I do have concerns about the ADU portion of it though, because in that instance, it's one or the other for the entire year. And when I personally voted for ADUs, I did not see the intent of one of those houses to be available in an STR, because it was more of a vote for affordable housing. I think STRs go against that in a sense. So that portion of the language of the contract is something that contradicts my reason for having ADUs in the first place. So that would be one portion that I would like to see re-examined by council.
Councilmember Martinez?
I have a couple questions. I'm trying to decide which one to ask next. I'll just ask the simple one. So a couple of places in here, it says the city has the right of inspection at any time. What might prompt an inspection? Same thing that would prompt an inspection for a regular homeowner, like site improvements, or is it random complaints, or what would prompt an inspection? I'm thinking in terms of safety.
We would likely receive a call from a renter of the property, say exposed wiring or some safety matter, would trigger us to do the full inspection, the property maintenance inspection that our building division conducts.
Point of information?
Is it a question? Yeah,
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Do we currently have the capacity on our staff to conduct however ad hoc complaints may arise based on our best projection in terms of how many short-term rentals we have now and may have in the near future? Let's predict based on the data we have. Does it seem feasible to manage this as we are now?
I would say that the concern about resources is centered around it's front-loaded, actually trying to find who's operating a short-term rental and whatnot. I think when it comes down to individual inspections that we would get calls about,
Sure.
I'm not so concerned about the resources in terms of staff for that. It's really the dynamic of working through these websites and finding that 4075 is operating as a short-term rental than it is, say, if we get a call from somebody to say there's a safety matter. I think we're capable currently to manage that part of it.
Thank you, Mr. Burkholder. Mayor, there's a second part to this question.
Could you hold off until
I
others?
certainly can.
Great.
Yep.
Mayor Pro Tem is next, and then Member Barentine.
Back to the primary residence piece, one of the questions that I have, I agree with Councilmember Sierra, that it says a residence used as a short-term rental shall be the primary residence of the legal owner. ADUs may be used as a short-term rental, however, only the residence or the ADU may be granted. By having that second piece, it kind of void and nullifies the first piece. The owner cannot both have as his primary residence the ADU and the residence on there. So I think that we need to be careful about doing both because it's conflicting language. Thank you.
Okay. Member Barentine.
I have a point of clarification first, please, and then I'll ask my question. Part of the concern, the reason we got so many of them and so much confusion was that there was this constant narrative being out there that we didn't really have rules, so that really wasn't against it. I really appreciate that you clarified that short-term rentals are currently not allowed. They're not allowed. And I want to clarify, I want to make sure that we don't end up with the same problem with the comment that the mayor made earlier, because I'm sure it's with good intention, but I disagree with that. I'd like to have a clarification. Businesses are not allowed in R1 areas. They're not allowed. And this goes to what the mayor
Home businesses.
what the mayor pro tem brought up earlier is an issue with this. And so I want a clarification on that so that there's no misunderstanding to where somebody's doing some other kind of business, including this one, where they think that that's currently allowed, which it is not. Then my question would be, along with the residence piece of it, if you take the property that Councilmember Quest brought up, that property is advertising that it has 6 bedrooms. And with this, it would be over 12 adults that could go ahead and kind of converge on this house. So some people went there, since this is for sale, and took a look at this property, and it seems a little sketchy on what's considered a bedroom. I mean, they had mattresses all over the place, but I'm not sure that that's what a bedroom would be. So do we have a definition of what we would consider a legitimate bedroom rather than just somebody putting a mattress on the floor?
there's definitions of bedrooms and kitchens and that, and different living quarters and sleeping quarters in the residential building code. So we do have an official
Will those be included in this so that people know what a bedroom is?
We can certainly reference that.
All right, thank you.
I think it might be Member Martinez.
Okay, let's see. I had the same question that Councilmember Wink kind of touched on. I think in here it says something about, I want to say 60 days to get, if we pass this, for folks to come into compliance who are operating them. Is that a realistic estimate of time? Or should we kind of consider expanding that duration of time to make sure we do it all thoroughly and, all that stuff? It just seemed like a short period of time to me, but, I mean, I ideally would like to get them all done right away so everyone can come into compliance more quickly.
And we're going to need to have an educational period to, explain to the community what the regs are. 60 days may be a little short in order to do all that. That number was included basically for that point. Let's try to get as much done and as quickly as we can. It's going to take longer than 60 days on some instances, so I guess what I'm saying is either way, that's what we landed on currently, with the knowledge that some of these are going to take a little longer to come into compliance and for us to make contact and educate them and whatnot.
Right. Member Wink, you had a second part of your question, so do you want to ask that, or?
I did, Mayor, thank you. I don't know if it's quite relevant as I thought previously, but I was wondering about any research that community development or our planning and zoning team conducted about other municipalities around the country, or well, worldwide even, that offer randomized checks. This might be a little heavy-handed, but so compliance checks that aren't initiated based on a complaint. I had a strict upbringing, so forgive me. But I wonder if it exists, if it's something that you thought about, talked about.
The communities that I looked at when I was drafting the regulations, all of them had used some sort of third-party compliance. That seemed to be the most common avenue for compliance. And I don't believe that those companies offer kind of a randomized check for compliance, but I'm not sure. They could very well be.
And one thing, thank you, I do want to say is I'm really grateful for the write-up about the third party on that last slide in our packet, or the last page of the packet. And it's not just monitoring, it's evaluation and a measurement of the different objectives and the different practices that this company would offer us. So I think we would get a tremendous amount of information that the citizens and staff and council alike would feel very beneficial in terms of understanding what's happening and why. So thank you for that.
Member Barentine.
I need another clarification first, and then I'll ask my question. Councilmember Martinez asked about getting people into compliance once or if this passes, and I have a problem with that, because what we're asking people to do is you were running something illegally, and we're going to be very considerate about getting you into compliance. So I think 60 days, I think 30 days, I think immediately that they should be under the same criteria as anybody else that's now going for it, and just because they were doing it illegally shouldn't give them any. So I have some problem with allowing in an ordinance addressing that. So if we could get some clarification on that, I would appreciate that. And then Councilmember Sierra on his own block has one where somebody is renting the house, the top part of it. They're doing a short-term rental for the bottom, so they kind of have the people that are on the top kind of managing the bottom, but the person who owns the house doesn't live there. So it is possible that, I mean, we don't want to give the impression that we're going to have, even if people were in compliance, that something could be a short-term rental year-round all of the time, because you have somebody potentially living there, maybe they're skirting around it with a rental person or whoever. So my concern is with the company that you did to do the compliance, and I guess I was a little concerned, one, that they didn't participate in the ordinance piece of it at all to give their input, which is something that apparently professionally they do, but that we only went to one company. The way that their literature is written makes it pretty clear that they are competitive. They say they're competitive, which makes me think there's other people who do it, and I would like to see some information from some other entities that do the same work, and how they handled it and what they might be able to provide as well.
Member Martinez? Oh, Member Sierra's next.
This might be a little bit harder to answer, but is there anything that we can state to Airbnb or VRBO or Booking.com that kind of stipulates some of the city regulations? I think personally, in some of the instances that we've seen where you advertise a property as a party house, that to me is almost an automatic violation. It just gives a spring break feel, and obviously isn't what the intent of STRs are, but just curious if there's anything that we can state, or if we have any kind of, ability to do anything with those sites.
Probably not surprising. They're very difficult to communicate with. There are some very large cities that have been successful, New Orleans, San Francisco, in being able to get through to have language included in there for those larger communities. We can always give it the college try, but I would caution that it's probably not going to be met with a lot of responsiveness unless, I'm not for sure on this, but I think New Orleans may have had a lawsuit in order, or San Francisco, one of them, to get Airbnb to put disclaimers on the site. So it would be tricky to do, but we could certainly reach out to them and try.
Member Martinez?
This is a more general question, and my fellow council members kind of touched on it, and I'm sure the planning and zoning folks had a lot of conversations around it, but one of the things that people really like about our community is that we have really tight-knit neighborhoods, and we're really close with our neighbors, and people really like that. So how can we ensure that entire blocks aren't kind of negatively impacted by this? And I know it's a really general question, but I think that's probably on the mind of a lot of folks.
Well, there are communities out there that have implemented distancing requirements. I worked with one very closely for several years that had a 500-foot separation distance from a short-term rental. Of course, that community also required them to go through a conditional use permit, so it was a much more rigorous upfront practice there. There are communities out there that will say one per block.
That's kind of what I was thinking, something along those lines.
So it has been done, so that, that in the discussions with planning and zoning, added to the, enforcement and monitoring, and, do you take the measurement from the property corners? Do you take it from the house? So it was a lot of more detailed discussion.
Point of information. May I interrupt you, Member Martinez? Also to this end, did planning and zoning and your team look at these in terms of sort of destination cities with short-term rentals versus not so much? So, I've been to Traverse City, Michigan, and everybody's homes, these beautiful big homes, it's just, they're all short-term rentals. There are other cities, you mentioned New Orleans, there are other cities that aren't such big vacation destinations where we practice short-term rentals. Did you look at that sort of bifurcated in that level to examine different policy that might suit our instance better? Thank you.
We
Member
did.
Martinez.
We did. Locally, we looked at Arvada, we looked at Westminster, those types of communities. But then we did look at a lot of the California resort communities. We looked at Portland, just to get a flavor as to some of the requirements that might be beneficial to us in our situation. So we did. We looked at a wide range of communities.
Member Martinez, were you finished?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the question of how would we kind of maintain our neighborhoodliness that people love about it, and wondered if we had considered any kind of like limit on options and if that's realistic and how that would work. Obviously, the enforcement piece is a really big part of that, but I just wouldn't want, someone to have maybe like in my house and on both sides of me constantly have people in and out. You lose that neighborhood kind of closeness that I think people really enjoy here.
Sure.
So just want to throw that out there.
Sure. And that's definitely the balance we have to weigh as we discuss, the short-term rental phenomenon. Again, I've seen some communities cap the number, 2%. Based on the number of households you have in your community, you can only have 2% as short-term rent. So there's a lot of different variations that are out there. But more specifically, that was not a primary topic of the Planning and Zoning Commission when looking at this language tonight that we presented.
I'm going to have Mayor Pro Tem Russell ask the last question, and then let's talk about what we do next. I'm going to suggest that maybe it comes back to another study session, but you can think about that and we'll come around again.
Okay, and I really think we need one study session just for the enforcement piece. But the one thing that I just wanted to bring up was this short-term rental community forum when you had the different people there.
Right.
Denver
Right.
was amazing.
Right.
They had done it right. But the problem is, we're not Denver. We don't have the resources. They have dedicated staff to compliance and everything. And they said that evening that they believe they would not have been as effective if they didn't have staff. Hiring a third party just does not work like having a staff member. So.
Just a
Thank
couple
you.
comments. Sorry. The compliance issue is, of course, the big one on this. It's either way. I know that there are lots in my neighborhood. Neighbors tell me that they're all over the place. I don't know where they are. But I know that my neighborhood is close to Swedish and Craig, and so maybe it's the largest one. That's the destination feel, of what it is. Two things. One is that those of us that live in neighborhoods that had HOAs from the 1950s that sort of repeat themselves, that is held in the county, correct? And that's administered out of the county. You can't even actually enforce anything on those, right? I just wanted to make that really clear because we've dealt with that in my neighborhood. So that's a second issue that those neighborhoods would have to figure out.
Right.
And then secondly, do you feel like you got enough questions to chew on a few more things to bring back to us with some more info? It sounds like there were not a lot of different ideas and things that came up. Would it be best if we had more ideas that came in the next few days to send them off to our city manager and she can send them on to you if there are other issues that haven't come up yet for you to bring back some more info on?
I think absolutely tonight's been very helpful. I appreciate all the comments and questions. If there are some that come up, yeah, certainly forward them to Ms. Hargrove. And
so are you interested in another a study session on this to decide whether or not we bring it to a public hearing? And then Member Cuesta, you want to start us out?
You bet. And I didn't realize, excuse me. I didn't realize how close we got to 7. I thought we were, after questions, we would get to comments. Is that not the intention this evening?
No, we don't have enough time, obviously. So I think this is obviously a 2 to 3 study session kind of material.
I guess the only thing we've seen thus far is a proposal to allow it, and we haven't even seen any language to consider to ban it either. And I've had those calls as well. And so I think that language could be assembled pretty easily. I do still think it's hazy as the language is currently written. I know that you're saying it's prohibited now. I don't think that that's crystal clear. We don't have fines involved. So I think that language before council to ban it as well would be something worth considering. I'd certainly leave that open to my colleagues as well, but I'd like to see it. Thank you.
Okay, Member Martinez?
I would very much like to see it come forward again for another study session. Planning and zoning spent, I think, 14 study sessions? That's a lot of time. And so I don't want us to just also let this sit on the shelf. I want to keep it moving forward and to respect their work and what our community needs. So.
Member Sierra?
I too want to see it come forward to another study session. I do want to thank the work of the planning and zoning. It was a very thorough document, and it was very easy for me to just understand exactly. It sounded like you did take into account just about every possible instance. So thank you very much for the work.
All right, for the sake of time, it sounds like everybody wants to keep it, have it come back again with a little few more answers to the things that we're asking for clarification on and any further ideas that come up. Sure. So we'll adjourn this meeting and move it next door for the regular meeting. Thank you very much for all your work on this.
Thank you all.